All right, we are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Ladies and gentlemen, it is always a pleasure to welcome to the program our next guest. David Dayen is a contributing writer at Salon, The Intercept, The Fiscal Times, The New Republic, and, I mean, you are like the king of all media, aren't you, David?
Maybe a lesser order, maybe just a lieutenant of all media.
Or what about like the crown prince of all media? How's that?
The clown prince, I think.
Oh, please. And honestly, I mean, I've said this for years, but nobody writes on more topics with more depth than you, in my estimation.
I appreciate it.
And I mean that anywhere.
Right. Thank you.
I mean, I don't want to speak to what your home life must be like, but I gotta think there's not much else going on.
I live in a small basement. There's nothing on the wall to distract me, and there you have it.
Well, I've asked you many times before too. Like, how many do you sleep at all? And my guess is honestly, you probably do. One of those people that get 3 hours of sleep a night. But let's leave that aside for a moment, David, because I really
more like 6 if we want to get into the personal life.
6? You know, They say you need 8.
I know that's an Ariana Huffington thing, right? I
Yes.
guess that's why I don't write for her.
There you go. She doesn't like your sleeping practices.
Doesn't want my sleep schedule.
All right. Well, let's talk about this piece that you've written in the American Prospect, not even one of the 5 publications I mentioned up top.
Yet another.
This is a big piece that you've written, a deep dive into the idea of antitrust. And you do mention, and it really the only time I've heard really any talk of this, I mean, obviously the net neutrality fight was a big issue, but in the course of her campaign for governor in New York State, Zephyr Teachout did bring this up, and you mentioned that in your piece. But you also start with the story of a medical device company, Retractable Technologies, which you weave throughout your piece. Just tell us the story of that and why you chose that story to weave throughout your piece.
Sure. Retractable Technologies is a company that was founded by a guy in a place called Little Elm, Texas. His name is Thomas Shaw. And in the 1980s, he was watching news reports about the AIDS crisis, and particularly this epidemic that was occurring in our nation's hospitals, known as needle stick. And needle stick occurs when a nurse or a nurse's assistant or some sort of medical technician, delivers a needle. And because of the way syringes are built, there is a lot of risk that once you depress a needle into the patient and take it out, there's a lot of risk of accident, that you can be stuck by the needle and then you have this contaminated needle in your arm. And this was leading to a surge in the 1980s of both incidences of contraction of AIDS and contraction of hepatitis. And Thomas Shaw was an engineer, and it seemed like a solvable problem to him. So he spent years buying tons of syringes and trying to come up with a way to, build a better mousetrap, build a better syringe, one that would reduce or eliminate this risk of needle stick. And he figured it out. He came up with an idea for a retractable syringe. That's why they're called Retractable Technologies. Basically, you would depress the syringe into the patient, and then it would automatically hit a ring and retract once it's completed its payload of medicine or whatever you're depressing into the patient. And when you pull it out, there would be no needle sitting there just waiting to be plucked into the arm of a medical technician. So this was, not only did this guy invent this thing, but he got a grant from the National Institutes of Health, hundreds of, I think millions of dollars, to market and develop and produce these syringes There was actually a federal law that was dedicated to reducing the incidences of needle stick, which was a real epidemic at this time.
Right.
And his technology would have fit perfectly. So everything was working out for Thomas Shaw up until the moment when he tried to sell the retractable syringe. And that's when he found out that about 60 to 80% of the syringe market was owned by one company, a company called Becton Dickinson, or BD. And when he would try to go into hospitals and say, look, I have this thing that's going to be better for your employees, better for safety, will comply with federal law, it's better for pretty much everyone, they would say, well, we buy our syringes from Becton Dickinson, and we buy them in such a way through something called a group purchasing organization that we would take severe penalties if we didn't buy our syringes from Becton Dickinson. And Thomas Shaw has, in the 2 decades since coming up with this product, tried to use the antitrust laws to say that this company, BD, was monopolizing this market. They have made it inhospitable for us to be able to compete on a level playing field and sell our product, which actually works better. He has successfully won 2 large cases that resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements that have gone from BD to Retractable Technologies. And yet, today, Retractable controls maybe 1% of the market. That's their market share, maybe 1%. And Becton Dickinson still controls the majority of needles sold in America today. So from
Retractable's standpoint, the guy's making money, but he's not doing what he wants to do, is bring this solution to the hospitals, because apparently BD has a lesser quality product.
Correct. And the perfect stat to illustrate this is that when Thomas Shaw was starting out, there were about 380,000 needle sticks a year. Now, today, when we have the technology to eliminate them, there are 385,000 needle sticks a year. So the reason I use this example is that people talk about monopolies solely in terms of price, right? That when you have a monopoly, that monopoly actor can then jack up the price of a particular good because they have no competition, and if you need that product, you're going to have to pay the price. But it's not just that. That is not the only thing that monopolies affect. In this case, it's affecting the quality of life and the safety of workers. Because there's a monopoly on this particular product, medical technicians are at risk. And preventable diseases are being propagated throughout the population for no reason, only because it matters to the bottom line of Becton Dickinson, who has engaged in these monopolistic practices for decades and decades and achieved this monopoly that cannot be dislodged even after multiple lawsuits showing what they are doing.
So, in the law, I want to clarify 2 things. One is that the lawsuits are private lawsuits.
Yes, this is not antitrust enforcement. There's a difference between using the antitrust laws as a private litigant and using them through an enforcement action through either the Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission. Both of them have overlapping responsibilities.
Okay, and then in terms of the way that BD maintains this monopoly, do they sell other products that the hospitals need at a discounted rate, or is it that how is it that they maintain this when the hospitals could get these products? Obviously the availability of the product. What is it? How do they?
These you would have to go into this group purchasing organization kind of way in which large medical device suppliers supply hospital chains. And through these GPOs, they basically give discounts to the hospital if they buy the product, but they lock them into a contract. Often there's something called the 90-10 rule in it, where if you decide that you're going to buy this product, you have to buy 90% of it the next year. And if you don't, you get hit with these huge penalties. You have to basically give back all the discounts that you ever got. So that's the way that this is generally enforced. There are other means by which it's enforced, and a lot of it is not so much monopoly as oligopoly. I mean, what Thomas Shaw said to me is that Johnson & Johnson has the ability to make a better syringe tomorrow if they wanted to. But if they don't get into the syringe market and Becton Dickinson doesn't get into the Band-Aid market, then everybody can sort of keep their market share in their various positions within medical devices and supplies, and everybody's happy. So that's what tends to happen in that particular sector, and this is replicated throughout the U.S. and global economy. I mean, I go through in the piece the concentration of industry that we've seen over the last several decades, and it's really remarkable that there's almost nothing that you buy on a daily basis that isn't part of some very concentrated market.
Fascinating. All right. Well, let's go back to the history of antitrust in this country, and then we'll talk about. I mean, you list a couple of examples of just how monopolized different products are. The idea that one company makes virtually every different brand of sunglasses in the world, and
the stores where they're sold.
Well, that was the amazing thing too. They own Lens Crafters and Pearl Vision and Sunglass Hut, and
the company's called Luxottica. It's an Italian company.
And I mean, everybody's familiar with the sort of the state mandated cable monopolies, and everybody I think has a fairly pronounced opinion on how effective that is.
And what do they look to when people talk about how crappy their cable service is? They do talk about how they jack up the prices, but they also talk about the fact that you have to wait from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. on an odd Thursday if you ever want service. They talk about the quality of the product.
Well,
too.
also, if you're like, for instance, if you're outside, I don't know what it's like in other parts of the country in terms of rural, but I know that in just 2 hours outside of New York City, the internet speeds are shockingly low. I mean, they're like dial-up, quality.
And what is the incentive for a Verizon or an AT&T or a Comcast when they have a virtual monopoly in that community? What is the incentive for them to deliver a better product? They're not competing.
Zero.
There's no incentive. In fact, when we see these community broadband operations in places like Chattanooga, Tennessee, they get massively faster speed. Mm-hmm. This is not a technology problem. This is not an issue that we have to solve with better fiber optic technology or something. It is purely because it is cost effective to people who don't have to compete for your business to deliver a worse product.
Absolutely, 100%. All right, well, let's talk about the history of it, because it was the first antitrust law that we saw in this country was the Sherman Act. Is that right?
Yeah, the Sherman Antitrust Act.
And
this followed a period, we called it the Gilded Age. This followed a period of extreme concentration that largely came about through railroad monopolies. And the railroads were able to, because they had this brand new technology, and they could be gatekeepers in terms of getting goods to market. They had a large influence on what got over to consumers and what didn't. And so the railroad trusts were a major part of this. The telegraph as well, because communication that went cross-country had a gatekeeper as well in it. So it kind of mirrors, from a technological standpoint, anytime you have this disruptive new technology that comes into a marketplace, it offers opportunities for monopoly actors to use it and collect tolls on it and concentrate that sector in major ways. So what we saw at that point, and you can even go back even further. I mean, the Boston Tea Party largely was something that was a reaction to a monopoly, the British East India Company being able to have a monopoly on the sale of tea. So Americans had this sense that big concentrated industries were a threat to liberty. That they were a threat to not just the ability for people to get a good at a fair price, but the ability on economic liberty to, if you had a certain set of skills and talents, that you could actually bring them to bear and make a living for yourself in what you wanted to do without having to be squeezed out by a large monopoly operator. So there were movements in America, particularly around the Gilded Age, when this became just really intolerable, whether it was farmers who had trouble getting their goods to market because of the railroad monopolies, or it was usually interest in, I think this started really kind of in the West, people who were skeptical of Eastern business interests. There was the progressive movement, there was the Granger movement, and eventually this, fluttered up into Washington, and we got the Sherman Antitrust Act. And
is that what it was? I mean, a lot of because I'm just curious. I mean, it sounds like to a certain extent, a lot of this was sort of like agrarian populism on some level,
absolutely,
pushing back against because my sense is that the railroad barons owned to a large extent like governors more than they did maybe federal, and an occasional senator. And I think most of my knowledge of history at that time is pretty thin.
Well, of course, senators were chosen by the state legislature,
right?
So they were, there were corrupting influences within the Senate because that came more directly from state government. The House was more closer to the people at that time, and I think what we saw, there wasn't just the Gilded Age, but there were like financial crises every 4 years, right, during that time, and so this did generate a populist movement that eventually became something that Washington couldn't ignore.
Maybe that's the biggest argument for going back on the gold standard, is that we would have those type of massive financial crises every 4 years, and we would see a little bit more of a backlash. But let's put that on hold for the time being. So at the time that the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed, there was
unanimously, by the way, almost unanimously, the Sherman Antitrust Act.
The authors made clear that innocent monopolies, ones that didn't set out essentially to become monopolies for an advantage, but rather because they were so good at business, they created monopolies, right, were okay as long as they did not have, bad effects on the on innovation and on price competition.
Right. There was kind of this split. And the best way to think about this split is to think about the 1912 election. The 1912 election, you had William Howard Taft was the president, and that was the Republican idea was basically laissez-faire. It was that's the faction that Taft came from anyway. That was monopolies are fine. We don't have to mess with it. Roosevelt, who was president prior, he was the Bull Moose Party in that election. They believed sort of in in finding the right people to administer the monopoly, and as long as they were enlightened and they could manage it in a very studious way, that wouldn't be a problem. So it was anti-monopoly, but it was anti the wrong kind of monopoly, basically. Wilson, and particularly his chief speechwriter, Louis Brandeis, who was later a Supreme Court justice, was really motivated by a reaction against bigness. That there wasn't a right monopoly and a wrong monopoly, that this was a problem when you have this over-concentration. It inevitably slips into bad effects for Americans. And so, Wilson won that particular election, and the Clayton Act, which was sort of the follow-up to the Sherman Act, and they created the Federal Trade Commission, which has this additional responsibility on antitrust, was created. Ultimately, that didn't go far enough because we got into World War I, and there were a lot of other factors for why the sort of Wilsonian, Brandeisian idea of antitrust didn't get fully implemented. But the courts, ultimately, what happened is the courts ended up sort of shaping what the Sherman Act meant. The Sherman Act was very vague. It allowed a lot of leeway for the judiciary to interpret it, and it ended up interpreting it in the manner you described. This idea of there's the possibility for innocent monopolies, the possibility of they employed a test to see whether or not this tipped into something that was disfavored, and that's kind of where it ended up. And the issue is, Sherman Act passes like 1890. We don't really see real enforcement of the antitrust laws until after the Great Depression. We saw some of it here and there. Standard Oil gets broken up, and Roosevelt did some things, Northern Securities, but it's really after the Depression, and particularly when a man named Thurman Arnold is put in charge of the Antitrust Division by President Franklin Roosevelt, that we really see a strong enforcement of the antitrust laws, and supporters of antitrust like to throw out this chart that shows the unemployment rate, and it pinpoints the moment that Thurman Arnold was put in charge of the Antitrust Division, and that's the moment at which you see the unemployment just plummet. That's the point at which this goes down, and so Arnold was very aggressive. The golden age, so-called, of antitrust is between the 30s and the late 1970s, early 1980s, when you see enforcement, even if a company or the byproduct of a merger would lead to 5% or 8% market share within a particular sector. Even those would be challenged in the 1950s. There were cases where even if it was an innocent monopoly, as you said, even those not only would be challenged, but would be successfully challenged in court. That even if it was a monopoly that was by no other means than, good stewardship of the particular business, that would still need to be broken.
And during this era, what is the remedy? I mean, when this is the golden era, and you have more stringent enforcement, what is the remedy?
The remedy is often that they would block the merger. There were divestitures. There were breakups of various industries. The most famous didn't come till later. That was the Bell telephone breakup.
That is one that I remember. I mean, I remember when it was all it was one company,
Right.
And then all of a sudden, we all had these sort of regional.
Southwestern Bell, and
yeah.
now and then they all reformed like a transformer into AT&T. But there were a lot of countervailing forces too. There were things called conglomerates that if you couldn't own 60% of one industry, you would own 20% of one industry, and then in addition to selling baked beans, you would make hats.
Right.
There was ITT was like this huge conglomerate of that day, and there were a lot of others, and that was sort of business's workaround to grow while not, running afoul of the anti-monopoly laws.
All right, so we have this golden era of antitrust, and then a guy who was famous for not becoming a Supreme Court justice, Robert Bork. Back when I guess he was was he just a professor, or
professor? Yeah, he was a former Solicitor General, but I think that came later. He might have been under Nixon, but he was a professor at Yale, and he was strongly associated with the University of Chicago, kind of Milton Friedman economic movement, and he wrote this book called The Antitrust Paradox. And in it, and that book and the ideas in that book are completely responsible for the shift in antitrust policy and jurisprudence that we see today. I mean,
and
100%.
And it's stunning because it's basically he just creates a myth, essentially. Right? I mean, that's basically what it is. It's like it's as if he wrote with all due respect to those people who think that the Bible is the Word of God. He creates a story, basically,
right.
And then you have all these acolytes who decide this is the story we're going to believe in, and this
right.
one explains everything. There's no data to support it. There's no, I guess they had models that would support it, but the actual data does not exist.
Right.
And that's basically this notion that the only reason why monopolies in and of themselves are not bad, it's just that the Sherman Act is basically just to protect consumer welfare, and you could actually sort of project out and assume that a monopoly is going to help consumers just as easily as you could not help them.
Absolutely. I mean, he brought this into a very economic realm. And once you put it in the hands of economics, you can certainly find any number of economists willing to say, well, this will create efficiencies if there's economies of scale, if you have a more concentrated sector, and those benefits will go on to consumers. And it was not a theory in Bork's mind. It was what happens. I mean, this was just absolute. And as you say, there actually is no evidence for it. There's a guy out of Northeastern University named John Quokka who did this large retrospective study looking back at mergers over, I think it was a 30-year period, and looking at the change in prices since to Bork it was all about prices. So he took Bork on his own terms, kind of. And he said, okay, let's look at these mergers retrospectively and see what the change in prices was. And all the prices went up. I mean, virtually all of them. I think it was 38 out of 46 studies. And they went up more when there were these sort of conditions-based remedies, these things. This became in the vogue in the post Golden Age era. That okay, if you come up with some conditions that will make sure that we don't have a fully concentrated sector, whether it's a divestiture or some other promotion of competition, then that would be okay. This is what the Antitrust Division said, the FTC said. And basically what Quokka found is when there were conditions placed, it got even worse. That if it was 8% increase in prices for a normal merger, if in a conditions-based merger, it would be a 16% increase in prices.
So, in other words, even if you strip out all the other reasons why you don't want a monopoly, right, which is that market concentration, it stifles innovation, it makes it harder for other people to enter into a certain industry.
It hurts wages.
It hurts wages, and it also concentrates power that could ultimately end up as political power.
Correct.
Even if you eliminate all of that and just take it based upon the very narrow construct that Bork had said, that in and of itself was a fiction that the entire Reagan administration, it seems like, operated under either knowingly or unknowingly that it was a fiction.
Not just the entire Reagan administration, but the entire judiciary. And what the Reagan administration did is change the guidelines in the Justice Department, the guidelines for which they would actually challenge a merger or challenge an industry that was more concentrated than it needed to be. So once they did that, it wasn't really just that impact, but Bork's writing had a strong impact on the judiciary. And of course, in the 1980s, through the 12 years of Republican rule, a lot of Federalist Society, hardcore conservatives, even if Bork didn't get on the Supreme Court, a lot of Bork acolytes got into federal courts all over the country. And they implemented Bork's ideas on this. And it became something that antitrust battles became battles between competing pairs of economists. And you had to come up with all this data, and there were models, and there were charts, and it stopped being a political issue at that point. It became an issue of, well, if you can see the consumer welfare on this scale that we created, if it tips in one direction, then we're going to allow the merger. If it tips in another direction, we're not going to allow the merger. And it became much more and more stringent on the part, it became much more difficult.
So, in other words,
the Justice Department to actually act.
It didn't actually stop becoming a political issue. It presumed to be a question of like a technocratic question, as opposed to simply a decision.
It shifted the terrain,
and
it stopped being talked about. Even though, the great irony, and I put this in the story, is that when we talk about breaking up the banks, we're talking about antitrust. When we talk about net neutrality, we're talking about antitrust. When we talk about the high cost of health care and the high cost of prescription drugs, we're talking about antitrust. But we don't talk about it that way, and there is no real movement, a consumer-based or an activist-based movement saying that the problems we're having is that we're being disempowered by this extreme monopolization, which has economic feedbacks and political feedbacks.
We should also say that when the Reagan administration did that, you write about the implications of, you had a huge rash of mergers, which was driven largely by Wall Street, because there was huge fees to be farmed and mined there.
I have a great anecdote that came out after the piece. We just recently.
Well, wait a second. Let me do this then.
What's that? Breaking news?
I got to do the breaking news.
I don't know how breaking it is. But,
all right. Well, okay.
So, Anheuser-Busch InBev and SAB Miller, which were already two of these huge beer conglomerates, they merged, or they've proposed to merge. And there was a story in the New York Times showing that they proposed to merge. And the last two paragraphs of the story names all of the law firms and Wall Street banks that were involved in the merger. And I counted them out. There were 18 of them.
Wow.
And all of them took a fee for that. More recently, in the Allergen-Pfizer merger proposal, I believe it's $350 million in fees that were generated just off of that. There's been $4 trillion in merger and acquisition activity this year. And you can see why Wall Street would be really thrilled for no more enforcement of the antitrust laws, because it means huge profits for them.
All right. So without getting too deep into it, we obviously see a lot of this in the context of the internet, of businesses that we perceive on the internet. Mm-hmm. Amazon is using their strength as a buyer, and we've talked about monopsony in the context of labor, where you have buyers essentially for labor, and why things like the minimum wage doesn't necessarily affect job losses in situations where you have some measure of monopsony. But we've seen things like Amazon basically saying to different publishers, like, you're either going to take a reduction in the fee that you get for making the book and for paying the writer, and the writer's going to take a reduction in fee, or we're not going to sell them. And if we don't sell your books, in this day and age, we've cornered the market. We're basically the country's bookstore, period. And we're going to, you can go and sell it at Powell's, but most people come to Amazon. That's just because they know us more. And we're also seeing this in the context of Facebook is about to make a big move where they basically, you got to put stuff natively on Facebook. In other words, it's got to start there, or people will not.
You're talking about news articles.
I'm talking about news articles and videos and whatever. It's going to be anything that is on the web that people put up on their own sites, that you put up at David Dayen Tumblr or whatnot, or frankly at the American Prospect. Nobody's going to see it if you don't put it directly on Facebook. So we have that problem.
We're seeing, it's a return to walled gardens, which is what they called the internet, or at least how the internet was described. Back in the days of America Online and CompuServe, if the internet was going to America Online and seeing what they had to offer. And that's what we're getting back to with things like Facebook and Amazon and, a handful of other companies. And Apple, to an extent, in music and video generation. So, this is just an extension of the Walmart problem, that Walmart has the ability to squeeze their suppliers because they have a large monopoly. And if you want your product in front of customers, you have to get it into Walmart. And this is just a digital equivalent of that. This is just, it's an extension. And monopsony, which is sort of the flip side of monopoly, it's not monopolies for consumers, but monopolies on producers. And that has just as damaging effects. I mean, we like the fact that we can go to Amazon, and it's the world's largest bookstore, and we can get a copy of a book for $5, but we don't think about the fact that the person who's writing it and the publishing company who produced it is not getting paid at the same level as they would if it was a normal situation.
Now, the big case I remember where I think monopsony came into play was the Microsoft case, right? Where Microsoft was saying, you can have our operating system to all of these PCs. You can have our operating system. You can have Windows. However, you got to take all this other crap that we're going to give you, and you got to put it on your computers, right? I mean,
right. And there are similar suits or proposed suits or investigations of Google in that respect to what they do with the Android operating system and what they do with their search engine that prefers their native products over competitors.
So where is the Obama administration been? How would you grade them? I mean, are we seeing any uptick in this type of antitrust enforcement? I mean, there's been some major mergers, I think, that have basically been quashed, which is good. And part of that seems to me to be coming from some voices in the Senate as well. Where's the Obama administration been, and where do you think we're going with this, if anywhere?
Right. It's a big question to answer. I think the general belief is that this has been mixed. That they came in with a lot of big talk. There's a theory that I know Barry Lynn, who's a great resource on all of this antitrust monopoly stuff. His theory is that Obama won the presidency because of antitrust, because in Iowa he talked heavily about the problems on food producers with dealing with agribusiness and these large monopoly chains, and how they were being treated unfairly in getting their goods out, and that won him Iowa and subsequently won him the election. So they took it seriously, at least for the first year or two. There were a series of field hearings that were held around the country about that very issue, about farming and monopolies. They withdrew some really bad opinions by the Bush Justice Department that were on antitrust. But when push came to shove, when you looked at the actual things that were happening, they retreated to using a lot of conditions-based remedies, which, as I said, are even worse than no remedy at all. They let a lot of these things pass. And in more recent years, the way someone put it to me is that the only reason we're seeing some pushback now, whether it's the Comcast-Time Warner merger or the AT&T T-Mobile merger, those kind of things being squashed, is that it's so concentrated now that you almost can't, you couldn't possibly wave your head and walk away from some of these merger deals that are being done. There was a study, John Quokka actually also did this other study, where he looked at what happens when various industries get concentrated, and say from 6 competitors, major competitors, to 5 competitors, or 5 to 4, or 4 to 3, 3 to 2, whatever. So the Obama administration, and this I think only went through the first term, but the Obama administration, when it got down to 4 to 3 or worse, they generally challenged. The Antitrust Division or the FTC generally challenged those mergers. When it was above that line, they almost never challenged. When it was 7 to 6 or 6 to 5, things like that, they almost never challenged the mergers. So it was those mid-level concentrations that they kind of neglected, and that allowed a significant amount of concentration to enter in, and then, you're just desperately trying to stave off the last bit of competition. That's kind of where they took their last stand. But it was a wide difference from how antitrust was enforced in the Golden Age, when, if there was a merger that created a business with 10% of the market, they would challenge it.
Interesting.
So it's a big, big difference. And so that leads us to the question of where we go now, where we go today.
Do you see something like this as being, this seems to me to fall right into a Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren portfolio. Are we going to see more of this? And I would say even, we've seen it at least with Al Franken in the context of the Universal Comcast, NBC Comcast merger.
Yeah. This is actually sort of a problem, is that Franken talks about it in terms of the cable companies.
Right.
And Elizabeth Warren talks about it in terms of the banks.
Right.
And, nobody gets together and says this is an antitrust issue. It's still sort of walled off into these various sectors, and no one sees the bigger picture. This is something that's...
Do they not see the bigger picture, or is it because there's a lot of medical manufacturers in Minnesota?
That's certainly part of it, and Massachusetts. It's a good question, and there is nobody right now on the national level that is connecting these dots and saying that this is why you have economic anxiety. This is why you feel disempowered by this economy and this government. This is why big business has such power in politics. This is why it seems like every year our wages are stagnating, our services get worse and worse, the price of various basic needs like health care go up and up. Point to this. This is what Zephyr Teachout decided to do in her campaign. She tells me this story about how when she was asked initially to run for governor of New York, she said, I want to talk about this. and the Working Families Party pulled this issue, and it didn't really register with people.
Right.
Probably because nobody
even talking about it.
And she said, well, I want to do it anyway. And she held campaign events at Comcast, cable offices, and she talked about these issues in a lot of detail. And what she found was that once you cut through this with people, they get it, whether it's farmers in upstate New York or people who are struggling to pay their bills in New York City or the surrounding area. People did get it, and it was interesting that as you know, in that election, the counties where Teachout did very well were upstate.
Yep.
And that's the dairy farm counties where they get this issue because there is so much concentration in food production. And the suppliers, and that's who they are if you're talking about upstate New York, are being squeezed in tremendous ways. And so I think that campaign showed that there's a model for this. And, to her credit, Hillary Clinton has been talking about this. I think the spectacle of who's the guy, the pharma bro, Martin Shkreli, is the guy from Turing Pharmaceuticals who jacked up the price 5,000% of a life-saving drug. Right. The Valiant scandal, this Pfizer merger. You're starting to see it in terms of healthcare and pharmaceuticals, and maybe that's where it begins. But Hillary Clinton has been talking about the need for stronger antitrust laws, usually around the healthcare issue. Bernie has been talking about it in kind of an elliptical way. In his speech at Georgetown, he mentioned monopolies. So there's a possibility there, but I think we need to see it on more of a grassroots level. To the extent, and Zephyr Teachout told me this, to the extent that the Obama administration was disappointing on antitrust, part of that is on us.
Right.
There wasn't really a movement to force the administration to take a stronger enforcement stand, and so that became an easy promise to break.
Indeed.
And so what is needed is an antitrust movement, a bottom-up understanding of these issues, which affect all of us every single day, every time we go into any store, anytime we try to buy anything. There needs to be an awareness of how that is affecting us as consumers, as workers, and as citizens. And only then will you put politicians in a position to actually listen to these concerns.
David Dayen, the piece is Bring Back Antitrust. It's at the American Prospect. We will put a link to it, of course. Always a pleasure to talk to you, and thanks so much for this, David. Really fascinating stuff.
Well, thanks so much for letting me go into such detail about it. I appreciate it.
No, it's great stuff, and I'm glad you're writing about it because it's one of those, I think, big issues that I hope we see more about, at least in terms of the overall perspective on it, rather than sort of just nibbling at different edges of the elephant, as it were. All right, David, thanks so much.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.